Have you seen the microphones, by the way? Shove. Take the sock off. Look at that for a bit of engineering.
Nice.
That would do you an excellent grate of Parmesan, wouldn't it?
Hello and welcome to another episode of the new Silver Rose radio show. I'm Anthony Davidson, and today we're joined by Deputy Team Principal Bradley Lord. Hello, Bradley.
Hello, good afternoon.
And Trackside Engineering Director Andrew Shovlin. How's it going, Shov?
All good.
Yep. All good. So we are fresh off the back of the last weekend race in Zandvoort, quite literally the last race in Zandvoort. What's the feeling in the camp like, Bradley?
I think the feeling's pretty positive, actually. We were sitting in the airport, weren't we, on Sunday evening, and sort of coming off the back of a weekend where it felt a little bit strange because it was one of the first times this year we've not had the quickest car, so we were a little bit on the back foot through the weekend, and then we were totting up the points and realised it was our second highest point score of the season so far on a race weekend, and that actually, although we'd lost the main race to Norris and Ferrari was strong at different points, the McLaren was quicker as well, we'd actually extended the advantage in the Constructors' Championship too. So underlying the headline of a second race that we haven't won was actually a pretty positive story in terms of the championship.
So the whole team feeling positive from that one, rather than feeling like it might have been a race that got away from, especially the main Grand Prix, because it seemed like at points it was tantalisingly close, but then, like you say, Norris seemed to be on fire and got more possibly out of his car than what some had imagined.
It's certainly, the McLaren was a lot quicker in the Grand Prix than it had been in the sprint.
Yeah.
And that was maybe the bit we didn't know to expect and couldn't necessarily have reckoned with. But I think by the time we got into the race over half distance, and certainly into Kimi's second stint on that hard tyre, it was clear that we were going to have a real job to maintain the lead and actually, win the race, because, the performance fell away for Kimi and he was a lot less happy with the balance of the car. I mean, you can probably give a little bit more insight into that.
I was just listening to Bradley, who sounded quite pleased, but we've got a few things on the performance side to try and dig into.
Yeah.
Which we're gonna be getting on with that this week and see what we learn. But there were a few corners where we were pretty rubbish, like that combination of 7, 8, 9. You could
high
see
speed stuff.
Yeah, the faster speed, and it also gives the tyres on the left-hand side of the car a tough time through quite a bit. And we don't really understand yet fully what's causing that. We've got some ideas, but that's not a problem that we've suffered with so far this year. And there's plenty of circuits that have got kind of continued corners in one direction.
Did you not see that kind of trend in, say, Budapest Turn 4, for example, similar kind of speeds?
No, well, the speed, I don't know whether the speed's a thing or just the fact that because you've got right-hander after right-hander after right-hander, and we were a bit off the pace in the fastest of those 7, and then our problems kind of grew a bit as we went through. All the other corners look solid. We did improve it a bit with Kimi for main qualifying, and he was a bit faster, but it felt a bit like what we gained in one area we lost in another. But then, as Bradley touched on, the stint pace was bouncing around. Now we didn't change the car. We obviously had different compounds at different stages. But again, we need to understand a bit. George's first stint was a bit lackluster compared to his later ones, and then with Kimi, first stint was good, and then dropped a bit on the second, dropped a bit more on the third, a bit came back on the third. It wasn't like we were playing around with electronic settings or up and down on flap angles. And for him, the balance of the car was quite different stint on stint. And then also the two drivers, normally they report similar things with the car at the end of the race. They're both of them, their perception of the balance, and probably the reality is, George had a more understeery car, Kimi had a more oversteery car. If we look at how they were set up, we don't yet know quite why we got such a big difference. So, as Bradley says, though, really good to have a strong point scoring weekend when we weren't at our best in terms of performance. It was actually good fun. The racing was good fun on Sunday. If you're if you sat on the pit wall and having to make decisions in a hurry, and I think the whole team enjoyed that and rose to the occasion, and it was definitely a good result given where we were. But yeah, bit of head scratching to do over the next few days.
How was Toto's feeling, Bradley, after the race? Shove saying there, and you touched on it before, that the whole team felt positive. Maybe from an engineering side, you always feel like you could have had a bit more, but
Toto's, by his own admission, always a glass half empty kind of guy. So he'll be more on the, what was going on in turns 7, 8, and 9 end of the camp, and then also just looking at the last few races we've been. We were probably equal on performance with McLaren in ultimate race pace in Hungary, a little bit behind in Zandvoort. And is this a trend that we're going to see continue to grow over the next few races, or is it something that is, as we believe, I think, linked to the slightly out of phase developments that we've got with, and we've got 2 or 3 races maybe where we need to just make sure we're dotting all the I's, crossing the T's, and maximising the package we've got until we can bring a little bit more performance when, our next round of upgrades get introduced.
Yeah, James Allison, the last show that we did, he touched on that element of the upgrade race, that arms race that we all face this year, with a new set of regulations and how you have to plan it way in advance. In terms of what your competition do and then what you've got in the pipeline. So that's an interesting battle, and we're all waiting for that next one to come along.
And there's a hidden battle in there as well, in the the cost cap and how you're managing that in the most efficient way as well. Are you able just to throw new parts at it as you find performance, or are you waiting for certain parts to reach the end of their useful life to then bring the upgraded versions as well? And that's, it takes up a lot of people's time working out exactly the best way to navigate that, and lots of predictions on where we're going to score points, how the championship is likely to unfold, and where those optimum moments are.
Going back to the race in Zandvoort, let's talk strategy. We saw lots of other teams, because it was so close, like Shove mentioned before, because it was such a close race, it really made the strategy game very interesting. We saw a swap of positions with our 2 cars down into turn 1. George asked to let the flying Kimi past on a brand new set of tyres, and it all seemed to make sense. Was there any potential fallout ever going to come from that, or what was it? What was the feeling between the 2 drivers in that moment after the race?
It seemed good, to be honest. For one of the funny consequences of that early red flag was actually we were all sort of hot-footing it out of Zandvoort, and we actually only had the debrief on Monday after the race rather than Sunday in the immediate aftermath.
Oh, because it was all delayed.
Because things were delayed, and then everyone was sort of heading out, and both the drivers were in the press conference and have all of their stuff to complete as well. So, but I think from, George quite naturally asked the question, just sort of stress tested it when he first got the communication, but then understood that bigger picture that, with Kimi, we'd taken the chance of a free stop behind the VSC. If George had made the same stop, he'd have dropped behind one of the Ferraris and, given up that podium position regardless. And then really it comes back to what have you talked about beforehand, and how clear is how the team's going to operate. And we'd been really clear in that Sunday morning strategy meeting that it is too close for us to be able to lose any time at all with our 2 drivers fighting each other and costing each other time in that way. And so that had set the basis then for the decision. I think it's fair to say that had that been the other way round, we'd have done exactly the same thing in order to give ourselves the best chance of the P2 finish, and to give the car in third, again, the clear air and the best chance of holding position as well.
I think I mentioned it during commentary that I understood the swap of positions, Shove, from an engineering and strategy point of view. But then when it became a bit more obvious that Kimi was never going to catch Lando in front, because Lando had such speed, I was surprised that as a team you didn't think about giving George the overtake mode. A bit like how we used to play games.
We did. We had the conversation.
Okay.
And there was a bit of a debate, and in the end we decided that it's not a massive gain in terms of lap time there.
Was it like 2/10?
It's 2/10, yeah. And it's fair to say that 2/10 is on the straight. So that that's probably the place that you're going to be vulnerable. There was also some concern of just the cars getting tangled up if we're trying to do something clever that we've not rehearsed. But given that it isn't an enormous chunk of lap time and speed at that circuit, we felt actually it would be better to give George the clear air. Kimi just gets out the way, and that's probably George's best chance of getting a good exit and a good braking, because ultimately you can't follow with these cars at 2/10. So the way that a Ferrari would have got past him would have been if it made a lot of ground coming out of the final corner or went very, very deep on the brakes. But it was honestly, really impressive effort by George. You wouldn't have given him maybe even 50-50 odds of holding, both of them back.
Both Ferraris.
There was a good chance that one of them was going to get through. Maybe we were a bit lucky with that VSC that just took the heat out of it for a lap or two, and he was able to manage his energy levels. But as I said, when it's something that you've never practiced, you don't know whether you make it better or worse. But it's putting George in dirty air that's the bit that might not be helpful.
Yeah, understood. And and it's this first year of these new power unit and this new regulation, so maybe is something that the DRS trick, for example, that I think Sainz and Norris discovered in Singapore a few years ago. That was quite at the end of the DRS lifespan, wasn't it? So it wasn't like it was discovered straight away. Something maybe to think about.
And it was
in
a
the future.
slightly more predictable tool, the DRS. If you could orchestrate that right, it wasn't that somebody was suddenly going to deploy more DRS and find a huge advantage. Whereas the energy, I think, by its nature, is a little bit more unpredictable. And again, Zandvoort's a slightly easier place to get past than Singapore was back then as well.
So speaking of George, it definitely looked like he had a bit of a resurgence coming off the back of a break. He's got engaged. Maybe
I was going to say he's carried that very heavy ring round in his pocket for a while.
Yeah,
exactly. Getting the weight out was
exactly.
clearly helped him. Yeah,
yeah. But I think from a team's perspective as well, he said this is the most points the team has scored for how long now?
Since China.
So China
was our highest point score. Now that reflects the fact that we've missed opportunities as well, obviously with retirements and other things. We had the potential to do more. But yeah, it was a strong weekend from that point of view. Yes, indeed.
You do a lot of the work on Saturday and then...
But George definitely looked like he hit the ground running here in Zandvoort. It looked like he was rejuvenated. Maybe a circuit just suits his natural style. I don't know what it was, but it just looked like he was very much back in the game here.
I think, he had a lot to deal with at the back end of, the first half of the season.
Yeah.
So, some of it were issues on our side. We had races where we had a problem with the power unit that was costing him straight line speed, that was, driving him mad a bit, trying to work out how can he...
Was that ever discovered? Did you ever understand fully or was there an issue?
We did get to the bottom of that issue. Took a little bit of digging, and were able to resolve that problem ahead of Budapest. And Budapest, he had a stronger weekend, but that was something that we managed to understand.
It was great to see him win the sprint race at least, and his qualifying seemed completely on point the whole weekend as well. So hopefully he can carry that energy onto the next phase of the championship. But speaking of the next phase, the championship, in terms of a team's perspective, when's that upgrade coming? When do we see another step forward in pace? Because that has very much disappeared since where we were in Melbourne, for example.
The happy days.
It's the happy days. It's not a dominant car. Yeah, the first 6 races.
It's true that it's varied as well. If we look, Miami to Zandvoort, we've had a variation maybe of a tenth to McLaren because they were right on the pace in Miami. Norris hounding Kimi for that win, within a second as well. So it has bounced around, hasn't it, a little bit? But certainly it seems McLaren and Ferrari have both taken a step forward in recent races with the aero upgrades they brought. Yeah,
and I think ultimately we'll probably end up doing one less floor, one less bodywork than those teams over the course of the season.
There are some fans out there, I think, they struggle to understand this concept of this cat and mouse game or the leapfrogging game with the upgrades, and there's that feeling of that the team just isn't capable of bringing enough, say like Ferrari and McLaren are, in such quick succession.
To be honest, you could bring new bits every race if you had the money to make them. You might end up outsourcing stuff, but the thing that holds back your ability to produce parts is money. Where we would worry is if we were getting beaten by an amount that if we looked at how much performance is ready to go in the wind tunnel, if we didn't have an answer for it. And that's why we're sort of, reasonably confident to say most of this is an issue of phasing of updates, although as we touched on, Zandvoort, we've definitely got a question mark around, did we get the most out of the car? And it's how you choose to spend the money. But the fights we're in now, it's what we expected this part of the year to look like, to be honest. Maybe it's even a little bit rosier. When are we going to bring the package? Well, that comes for that block of flyaway races at the end of the year. So that's what we're targeting. We're looking forward to it, but we're actually enjoying this challenge at the moment of being in a really tight fight and having some good racing going on, having to get every little bit out of the car to get a pole position. And it wasn't the main qualifying, but George stuck it on pole in the sprint race. We were second and third in main qualifying. It's not like we've vanished from the picture, but as I said, we're enjoying that challenge and looking forward to the update.
Yeah,
looking forward to the update, and then also aware that at least 2 of the next 3 races are quite unusual low drag circuits with Monza and with Baku. Madrid brand new, and they're being on our game operationally and just learning the circuit, getting the all the learning done there, and making sure we're just building session to session. All of those things will be rewarded as well. So we're hoping that approach, that strategy pays off, that the things we've got in terms of the low drag packages at Monza and Baku also show their worth as well. And then in the background, we know we've got some engine penalties to take at the same time. So and talked about George's resurgence, for example. If Kimi is taking full penalty in Monza and starting from the back of the grid, it's good to see George on his form and able to be fighting up at the sharp end, while Kimi will be working his way through on Sunday afternoon.
So that's what you meant by penalties, plural. It's maybe starting from completely back of the grid, not just a new internal combustion engine and maybe just a 10-place grid penalty or something like this. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, certainly for Monza, we're expecting to be right at the back of the grid. It's likely that George will need a similar additional set of hardware in his pool at some point, and that's just the legacy of the early season problems playing out. But
if you look at George's race in Budapest, where it wasn't via a penalty, but because of the issue at the start, he dropped to the back. He made pretty light work of getting through, back up to the sort of points area, and that's Budapest. So the reality is, whether you do a 10-place or a back of the grid, you actually recover a lot of that ground so readily that you may as well just take what you need at that one point.
I think that's where you clearly see the top 4 teams are more than capable of just climbing through the field pretty quickly. This year especially. So in Monza, that's a good place to take the engine penalty. Should be, it's traditionally a place where you would do that because it's an easier track to overtake. How do you see it this year with the completely new energy management scenario, and therefore how do you govern which tracks you are going to take that potential penalty? How do you decide?
You just touched on Monza being one where you would take a penalty. I'd say we've regretted doing it in Monza previously because the degradation has been relatively low in recent years. The cars had low drag, so they weren't actually great for towing because they don't sort of punch a particularly big hole in that configuration, and also the DRS effect was very small
because of the skinny wing.
Because you're on a super efficient wing anyway. That was in the past. Now you've got a real energy-starved circuit, and it becomes one where there's 4 overtaking zones. You definitely can't defend at all of them. And if you are a faster car, we expect it to be relatively straightforward to make progress. But saying that, how do we decide where to take them? The main point is based on where do you need the hardware. And we've lost some internal combustion engines at reasonably low mileage. So the biggest thing is a case of, we need to take it by this point. And if that point is a race where you really don't want to be fighting from the back, we'll consider bringing it earlier. And I think that, there's a bit of a sense that we've got a lead in both championships. Let's do the painful stuff while we have a lead in both championships, not if that gets closer at the end, we don't want to be piling more and more pressure on ourselves.
And is it just Kimi that's got this penalty lingering, or is George?
No, it will hit both drivers. We're not yet quite nailed down where George will take his, but it's there for both of them because both of them have. We saw the retirement for George in Canada, Kimi in Barcelona, and then obviously George also had a stoppage in Hungary as well. Right at the end of his qualifying lap there, it could have been a much more serious impact for us had that happened in the race. So yeah, we've got some stuff to manage through in order to get to the end of the season on the freshest and most performant hardware possible. And it is always a trade-off, isn't it, as well, between where are you getting into a risky zone on sort of high life or high mileage components and things like that, and what's the risk of not scoring points from that versus the penalty of taking the grid penalty and having that deficit and then coming back hopefully through the field at the events where you need to do it, and yeah, which one statistically is likely to give you the best point score at the end.
It is. I was going to say, it is also there is a sort of probability of failure. It's never an absolutely known thing, and that's evolving race on race. So, with Mercedes and the customer teams, every race you put more miles on the power units. Every race they're checked and trying to understand whether previous containments for faults have actually solved a problem. And it could be that our optimism for taking a PU to the 6th or 7th race might be higher in a few races' time than it is right now. But every race we're rejigging plans just based on what we've learned and where we may have gained a bit more confidence.
And how does the very fluid calendar, I should say, that we have this year, how does that affect the team's perspective of how you work on the car, the upgrades coming? Because say like Malaysia is now suddenly in between Baku and Singapore, for example, and if you had been planning an upgrade for either Baku or Singapore or even later on, then having Malaysia in there now, surely that's got to hurt a bit more, or maybe push people on to develop parts quicker. Is that a consideration or a problem?
I mean, if they change the calendar, we're reviewing all of our plans. If any team was targeting parts for Singapore and suddenly they have Malaysia, they'll all be looking at can we drag them forward. And with the notice that people had for that event, I think everyone will be. And I think that that's the nature of the sport. Is you can form your own plans, but you've got to think like your competitors. And our competitors for a lot of the year were trying to catch up, and we knew that they would be bringing updates more frequently. It doesn't mean that by a certain point of the season they've added more performance than we have. They've just done it in a more expensive but more staged way. And with us, like the expensive things to do are front wings, floors, bodyworks, and they're often all developed together and they've got to go together, often just because they fit. So you can't do a floor without the bodywork that goes with it if it's a different shape. Where we've been able to bring separate bits that we're confident will function well on the current car, we've done that. So it's not like we've been stood still.
So a front wing or something like that?
We had a new front wheel shield at the last race. That will have given us a useful bit of performance. Without it, we probably wouldn't have had a double podium. Without it, we George might have been third in sprint qualifying, not first. He may have finished third. He may not have won it. So, there's a lot of push to bring these little bits to the car. But as I said, I think the big difference with us and a lot of our competitors at the end of the year will be that we've done less frequent updates of the really big, really expensive stuff like floors and bodyworks.
So Toto's come out to say we can't afford it. We can't afford to make all these upgrades like other teams are. I was a bit confused by that when I read it in the media. What's your take on it, Bradley?
It's the reality of this year and the situation I think that every team faces in the cost cap, and it's the big invisible constraint, I guess, in Formula One that every team is balancing. What's your how big is your team? How big's your organization? What's your budget for salaries and headcount? How much is then left for the hardware that you need to be doing and the all new car? How much of this year's car did people make this year versus last, and how all of that drops into the cost cap? And then what's left as a development budget? And every team has to figure out how they're going to do that in the best possible way. it's also how many spare parts you carry, how much stock that you have and carry within the team and within the race team as well. So you're trading off all these things all the time, and every team's trying to find the optimum. So as Shov has said, there are less it's a constant trying to find the most cost and performance efficient way to get to the end of the season and bring the performance that we are continuing to find week on week in the wind tunnel. When do you sort of cash that in and convert it into real world parts? That's the sort of the art in the science of it, if you see what I mean.
And the thought process doesn't cost you anything. That's not, you can't put a price on that. There is no price on thinking.
The wind tunnel is, as I think James said in it when he was in the last episode, the wind tunnel is still cranking away, still finding performance. And the question is, when do you cash that in from that sort of virtual world of the wind tunnel to the real world of on-car parts? And for example, take a floor. If you need an all-new floor, do you bring an all-new floor when you found that performance, or do you bring it when you also need to introduce a fresh floor in order to get to the end of the season with the quantities of parts that you hope to have? And those are the efficiencies that you need to be thinking about and finding. And if you're in catch-up mode, that is a different scenario to if you're out front and therefore able to potentially just phase things slightly differently. But it won't mean that by the time we're racing in Mexico, Brazil, Vegas, anyone has necessarily brought more performance. They may just have staged it slightly differently through the season.
So in like a athletic sense, it's like the 100-meter sprinter looking over their shoulder as they come to the line. There's no point continuing just to give it everything when you got the race won. You might as well, because you're already thinking about the next one. And for us, that's next year. It's very easy to think of the cost cap just being annually. You start and finish January to December, and that's your pocket of money.
Yeah.
But from what you say, that's not how plays out.
You've got next year to be considering as well. You've got what are the points when wind tunnels start switching over, when design officers start looking at the following year's car, all of those trade-offs that happen behind the scenes. As we've still got half a racing season to go, yet we are nearly 3/4 of the way through the year. And
it has changed with the car, because years ago you could actually have a pot of money assigned to a car, and a car, you might start thinking about it in February when you've got the last one out of the door and it's winter testing. You've got people straight on the concept work, and effectively you'll develop all through that year. You then launch it in February and you then race it for a year. And
I remember those days.
Define
and do a lot of testing
with him running me.
The tricky. They were happy days. But the tricky bit with the cost cap is you've got an amount of money in a year, and in that year you're racing the car that you've got. You're trying to develop that. You're also trying to develop the car that's coming. And as we get towards the end of the year, we're going to be making bits for the car that's coming. So there's always an element of push and pull. And if we thought that these championships depended on us being able to have brought an update to Zandvoort, we'd have probably worked out a way to achieve it. The fact is, we are in a good, we're in an enviable position of actually being in front. It's logical that we don't need to throw quite as many parts at it as our competitors, and also we're not just about being competitive in this championship. Hopefully this will go well, but we're having to think about the next one. And when you are in front, it does afford a bit longer term thinking. And as I said, we have made calculated decisions around the most cost efficient way to get through to the end of this year. Touch wood, we'll conclude that they were good decisions, but race by race we're reevaluating, are we doing enough? Are we bringing enough? What can we drag forward?
And obviously what it also means is that in those races where the margins are small, where we don't enjoy the performance margin maybe that we had at some of the earlier races, that's where the sort of operational excellence, the delivery of everything we've got in the car on each race weekend, the consistently strong pit stops, the improvements we've seen to start performance. So we're not losing places off the line, we're actually starting to gain places off the line. All of those details start to add up as well. And, that's where making the most of what we've got is so important in this phase of the season, and why, as we go all the way back to the sort of first question you asked, why actually underlying the notwithstanding the frustration, okay, we've got some things to understand, we've got some learning to do. Seeing the drivers deliver, the drivers working together, and the race team and the organisation behind them delivering to such a high level was actually a really encouraging thing after a run of races where we hadn't managed to get both cars to the finish in the positions they could have been in.
Is it easier for commentators though when we're not out front or on pole by a lot?
It's a good question, actually. I mean, I really enjoyed being on the mic commentating that race for Sky, and it was, in some ways, it's easier because it's such a hard fought race, and you don't know who's going to win, and there's so much action up and down the field. But it does tire you as well, with so much information coming your way. I guess it's the same for you in a busy race. On the pit wall, there's more to think about. But yeah, you have to go hunting for things and ideas, what to say when there's just a domination like it was in Melbourne from this team's point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I actually enjoy the racing when it, there's a lot to be said for when the car's super quick. But I think also what's nice with our two drivers is they realise that this is not a championship that's in the bag. They do need to work together. I think, when we had the years where we were super dominant with, Nico and Lewis, it was really just about which of them is going to win the Drivers' Championship. What's nice with Kimi and George is seeing how willingly they are to work together, to share information, to understand the car.
And to work against there's a common enemy or enemies out there, aren't there, now, with Ferrari, particularly McLaren of late, with Lando's performances.
Yeah.
How much do you put it down to, because Lando's out there saying, it was me, it's not the car, but you two are saying it is the car.
No, I reckon it was Lando. That was definitely Lando.
You've got to give him some credit, especially the last two races. They're circuits he enjoys. I saw, at least from where I was standing behind the microphone, I saw that he's able to get a lot more out of his equipment than his teammate has the last two Grand Prix. Maybe it just suits his style more. Do you give yourself any let off with that? From an engineering point of view, but
it's never one or the other. There's no doubt McLaren have done some really good work with their car. You would also say there are some tracks, Miami, Budapest, Zandvoort. You just remember Lando looking really strong there this year, last year, and as a style, it's a bit like Jensen, who was really good when it was an overheating track, keeping the heat out of the rear tyres, and being able to push at the same time. So I'm sure, there's a bit of both. I think we've had a lot of different winners over the course of the last 6 races. I think there's been 5 winners over 6 races or something. So when you say, do we give ourselves a bit of breathing space, you are looking at, well, where's the threat for the Drivers' Championship? Where's the threat for the Constructors' Championship? And you'd certainly say the last few weekends, you definitely wouldn't rule out Lando coming into the picture in the Constructors. We've never ever ruled out Ferrari. We wouldn't rule out Lewis being a factor in any of them. And I think for us, variety of winner is a good thing. It'd be nice if there's some Georges in there and some Kimmys in there, but having one really dominant competitor, that for us is probably the biggest risk that we face in the Drivers' Championship.
Yeah, and that is true to say even with Zandvoort. We're the team that has been in the mix for the win at every single race. We've won a chunk of them. We've been narrowly beaten or retired from winning positions at others. But while Ferrari have been strongest competitor at some, McLaren at others, Red Bull at several as well, we're the team that has sort of been there through all 12 so far. And if we can continue doing that and continue putting both cars up in the fight and in the mix, then as long as we stay reliable and translate it, we'll hopefully be in a strong position by the end of the season.
Well, fingers crossed that it continues that way. It's been great to chat. Unfortunately, we're out of time now, but look forward to the next couple of races and see what we can do. I'm sure we'll be back in the sim, pounding around a virtual Madrid or something very soon.
Yeah, I'm sure they're on the phone already, Ant. You need to get back over there.
Got it on silent, don't you? No, it's been great. Thanks for joining us here, and like I say, look forward to the next one. Cheers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.